morning, everybody. Hi, everyone. Everybody's having fun. Good morning, everybody. I love that everybody's having so much fun. Good morning, everyone. Hi, everybody. We need you up here. Good morning, everybody. I love that you're having so much fun and so much wonderful chatting. I love this. Welcome, everybody. Whoa! That got everybody's attention. Aww. Good morning, everybody. It is so wonderful to see you today and to hear you having such great conversations. Oh. Is this any better? Yes? Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to see you, and we thank you so much for joining us at the Norman Rockwell Museum today. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and we have a really wonderful program for you this morning. We have a wonderful speaker in connection to our recently opened, just last night, exhibition called Inspired, Rockwell and Erikson. And this is a show that actually examines the relationship of two giants in their field, certainly Erikson in the field of psychoanalysis and Rockwell as America's premier illustrator. This morning, we're very fortunate to have Sue Erikson Bloland with us. Sue is an accomplished integrative psychotherapist and psychoanalyst who also happens to be the daughter of Erik and Joan Erikson. She has more than 25 years of experience helping adults of all ages with a range of emotional challenges. Sue is a faculty member at the Manhattan Institute for Psychoanalysis and has written for the Atlantic Monthly, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and many others. She's the author of a book called In the Shadow of Fame, a memoir by the daughter of Erik Erikson. This morning, she will share fond memories of her relationship with her father, Erik Erikson, and his patient and close acquaintance, Norman Rockwell. Sue also told me that she was very closely associated with the Rockwell family. We're so pleased to have Peter and Jarvis Rockwell with us this morning. And when she was a little bit younger, she actually worked in a bookstore that was run by the brothers on Main Street in Stockbridge. And so lots of history going back quite a few years. So we're so happy to have Sue with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Sue.
Well, this feels like very much an honor. This is a lovely occasion all around. And the museum is so gorgeous, and the exhibit is so gorgeous that it's just a delight to be part of this. I'm really happy to be here. The first things I had to ask myself when Stephanie asked if I would be willing to talk today was, what claim do I have to any special knowledge here? I guess it might seem obvious, but it didn't seem obvious to me as I was deciding what to talk about, what would feel most important to me. But I think I have two claims to knowledgeability on this subject. One is that I lived in Stockbridge, certainly at the beginning of the relationship between our fathers. Moved to Stockbridge from California in 1951, which was the year after my father's book, Childhood and Society, had been published, and everything changed. That book really catapulted him to a kind of fame and visibility that certainly I had not witnessed myself before we moved to Stockbridge. So Stockbridge was where suddenly I saw that my father had become a different person to the world, and was a source of enormous attention and excitement and interest, and That was quite an awakening to a new reality. I did go off from Stockbridge to high school in Vermont. Peter and I both went to the Putney School. So I was away during a good part of the year for the first few years, but here in the summer. And as Stephanie said, I worked in the Rockwell's bookstore right on Main Street, which was, of course, a treat for me. I was, by that time, 15. And I was right there on Main Street and also just very much involved with the Rockwells as part of my Stockbridge experience. Kai also spent time in Stockbridge, not as much as I did, but he was a wine steward at the Red Lion Inn for one summer, where he was famed in story and song, and certainly had your share of being part of this community. So that's one basis on which I accepted this assignment. The other was that I have kind of a slant on this relationship between my father and Norman, which is kind of unique. Let me just take a sip here. When I decided 3 decades ago to become a psychoanalyst myself, which felt rather like jumping off a cliff. It isn't easy to walk into the shadow of great fame, but I did. And I discovered very early in my training, as I was beginning to read about psychoanalysis, about personality, about all kinds of things that I had kind of absorbed in my youth, but I certainly hadn't studied them, hadn't really learned the vocabulary, the way of thinking very fully. And I realized early on that my biggest preoccupation was the nature of fame. It was kind of like, what the hell happened, you know? All of a sudden, this thing where my father walks into a room and people are excited. I don't know if you think about it that way. What makes people excited in this life? Well, one thing is to be around a famous person. Go figure. I don't really understand this, but it's very deeply embedded in our psychology. I guess this must have something to do with having needed leaders early in the development of our species. So we needed a huge amount of transference to leaders so that we would be inspired to follow them. That's all I can say by way of understanding this phenomenon. But in this day and age, when it comes about the way it did with my father's writing a book, and suddenly people are excited to be in his presence, and you feel that. You feel the change in the mood in the room, the atmosphere around you. And it's pretty daunting, and then raises very big questions about, well, then who am I? You know, am I more important now? Some people seem to think so because they say, your father is Erik Erikson, can I touch you? What? On the other hand, he's very important and you're not. And that is very difficult. That's very difficult. You don't want to be the vicarious recipient of this fame. So I say all of this because, and I should add one thing that I think makes a little more sense out of it. At the time, in the 50s, in the 60s, my father was much more famous than he is now. Many people still know of him, perhaps you all knew of him, excuse me. And he's known, you know, in psychoanalysis, in academia, among the helping professions, but not to the general public. And there was a time when he was on the cover of Newsweek, like this, and people would see him on the street and say, can I have your autograph? Or the waitress in the restaurant is bringing the dessert, and she says, could I have your autograph? So that was a different, just so you know, he was quite a lot more famous then than he is in this day and age, which is fine with me. He was never as famous as Norman Rockwell. That is fame on another whole level. And so I'm not going to equate the two. Very few people are as famous as Norman Rockwell. But they shared this experience of having become famous for what they did, for their work, for their creativity. And I don't know how they could have been as close or as comfortable with each other as they were, based on the fact that they had this shared experience. So neither one was overawed by the fame of the other. And then I will say some more things about what they shared as a result of their mutual fame. It has also been discussed, even last night with the Schleins, how peculiar that Norman was my father's patient. And how often do we publicly discuss the relationship between an analyst and his patient? And certainly this many years after, of course, because they're famous. But the things were a little different at the time. I think the biggest difference, the biggest factor, was that Norman had no sense of secrecy about this whatsoever. Now, my father was sworn to a confidentiality. We therapists do not acknowledge who our patients are. It's just not, it's not ethically done. But there wasn't much choice in this matter, because Norman would introduce my father anytime he had the chance, saying, "Erik is my psychiatrist." And my father was not a psychiatrist, but close enough. And my father, that was my father's imitation that I just imitated, because my father thought it was hilarious. So it was a public relationship, and they were two eminent men in a town, where eminent men come together, in this case also in the Marching and Chowder Club, where they both had lunch with the other gentlemen, the other esteemed gentlemen of the town. I believe at the Lennox House. That's what Kai and I seem to remember. So secrecy was just not on the table. And I think, Steve Schlein reminded me that at Riggs, the whole issue of whether you socialize with your patients was on a whole different plane, because unless you're in an analytic institute these days where candidates do socialize with their training analysts, because that's the nature of the system, mostly it is really not recommended that therapists and their patients socialize with each other. It is not consistent with the whole idea of a very special transference, countertransference relationship that takes place in a particular space and is limited to that space. So that was, of course, any sense of that ethic was completely ignored in this situation. But at Riggs, I remember going to picnics where the patients were there and the doctors were there and the nurses were there and everybody socialized. So it certainly wasn't an environment that promoted secrecy. That you could be sure. So how does fame come into it as I think about their friendship and about, let's just talk about their friendship today. And I definitely have some thoughts about that. I want to say that there is a psychologist who's done a lot of research on what it is that distinguishes the most accomplished people in every field. What is it that, in his words, geniuses have in common with each other? And he says all the things he explored, birth order, parenting, childhood, whatever, he ran through a lot of possible criteria. And he said the most distinguishing feature is that geniuses are people who have a monomaniacal preoccupation with their work. They don't do anything else, really. They can visit other areas of their lives, but this is where they live. And people who have that kind of preoccupation with work just keep churning out the work, and they outclass everybody in their competitive range. And as in the case of these two individuals, they become very well known for it. So we could talk about, what is it that kind of predisposes people to develop a monomaniacal interest in their work, but I'm not even going to go there today. That's something to explore another time, though I have many thoughts. Both my father and Norman were absolutely preoccupied with work. I don't think anyone in this immediate table would disagree with me. What I wrote about Dad early on, in one of my first writings, I said that I thought he actually lived in a different universe from the rest of us, but he would come home for dinner, and he would be very interested in finding out what happened to everybody during the day. What did you do? What did you learn? How's your life? But he was always a little bit preoccupied. And as I might have said later, but I'll say it now, his mood would have been determined by the way his work was going. And you could say that about a lot of the time. His basic mood would reflect very much how he felt his writing was going. My understanding of what this is about, this preoccupation with work, as Norman clearly shared with my father, he was prolific. And why do they do it? I think these are two people, and I say this about all of the geniuses of the world. I'm making a category here. They don't express themselves nearly as well in their interpersonal relationships as they do in their work. Work is their most important means of self-expression. It's their most important means of communication. It's the activity that helps them most to process and to manage their own feelings. It helps them hold themselves together and just keeps them sane, basically. And I've heard so many people, writers, artists, actors and actresses, in every realm. If you listen for this in their interviews on TV, and of course I listen for interviews all the time because I'm so preoccupied with this topic myself, so often say, like David Letterman, what I am happy for 5 hours a week, the 5 hours that he's on television, or Philip Roth saying, I'm only happy when I'm writing. Somebody asked him, will you write another book now? He said, of course, because I'm only happy when I'm writing. And so many other expressions of the same kind of need for that work as a self-organizing and self-fulfilling activity. Clearly, this is something that my father and Norman shared, would have understood about each other, would have empathized with in each other, and I think had a great deal to do with a kind of deep understanding that they had of each other. Definitely, very deeply a part of the way they connected. Where did I leave this piece of Kleenex? Excuse me for 1 minute. This phenomenon of being so engaged in your work, so committed to work, has, of course, an underside, and that is that it separates people from the ones that they care about the most. It is a solitary activity. And I'm not actually weeping, I just have to do this from time to time. Both of them would have understood in each other without any discussion that there is a cost to living your life in this way, to being so dedicated to work that you make other people, vast numbers of other people, very excited about you and very interested in you, and promotes their giving you enormous amounts of attention and what they call love, and certainly respect and appreciation. The fact is that it does hold you apart. It has a cost, and that is both the gift and the torture of being exceptionally accomplished. They would have understood this in each other, that I would guess, I would say that probably most specifically in relation to their children, where they would both have felt such a drive and a need and a desire to be closely connected, and it was difficult because that was not the arena in which they were the most themselves or the most fully confident of themselves or knew even what to do. I think that's actually the best way to say it. My father often seemed not to know what he was supposed to do. Now, there's an irony in that. Of course, he was a child psychologist, but like I say, you can be brilliant in your work at the things that you haven't really mastered in your personal life. In fact, those are two sides of a coin. They go together. And I think that's an area in which these two people, kind and loving as they were, enormously humanitarian, thoughtful, had difficulty connecting deeply with their children. And I've said about my relationship with Dad that I always felt a sort of tension. I knew he loved me. I would never have said, I don't think my father cares about me. He did. He showed it. But there was never really an ease in which we could talk with each other and talk really openly. I didn't start doing that until much later myself, but I think, and I'm not going to speak for the Rockwell sons, but I know enough about Norman to know that he was pretty obsessive about his work. He didn't put it down often to have a long, drawn-out dinner and ask you how your day went. But I believe they were able to identify with each other in this area that was painful for both of them. And that would have been a huge source of natural intimacy. I'm not suggesting that they talked about it mutually. I would feel sure that that's something that Norman talked about in his therapy, whether my father was open in saying me too, or whether Norman just knew it, which is also possible. Okay, about the exhibit here, which is so beautifully done. We see around us a lot of evidence of my father as an artist, which you might not have known before this exhibit was put together. And there's no doubt that these two gentlemen connected as artists. What really needs special attention is what a fabulous psychologist Norman was. When you look at his illustrations and the way he conveys the feelings of the people, the tone, the mood, their psychology, he portrayed people in such reality that it's very, very striking. I've read about an interview where Norman was asked why he drew the way he did. And he said, I'm interested in why people behave as they do. I thought to myself, if you asked my father why he worked, why he wrote what he wrote, and he might have said, I'm interested in learning why people behave as they do. I think that was the curiosity that they shared. Norman's illustrations are clearly all about why people behave the way they do. He co-authored a book with Robert Coles. I just learned about this recently. Even before he came to Stockbridge or knew my father, I think it was even earlier. And Coles said about him, he's a lovely person and he has such a keen sensitivity to people. And I think that's really very striking because indeed he did. Norman said in the same interview, you have to be extremely human to be an artist. You have to take all the ills that flesh is heir to, the sadness, the joys, if you're going to be a human interest painter. I've had a lot of this, he said, acknowledging the painfulness in his own life. I think that both Norman and my father were the geniuses that they were because they captured in their work the heights and depths of human experience, the joy and the pain, the suffering and the transcendence. And it was their extraordinary ability to do this that drew people so powerfully to their work. It was also a source of deep mutual understanding between them. The irony of this brilliance is, and I have already said quite a bit about this, is that they were both much less able to express or reveal themselves in their most intimate personal relationships. And they both suffered this difficulty that they shared. But they could be very empathic to this in each other. They knew each, they would hardly have needed to talk about it. They shared this, this whole phenomenon of their lives. So they had something else in common that would surprise a lot of people. It certainly was a very big dilemma for me as I was growing up, and maybe one of the main things that required me to go into this field to try to understand my family reality, that these two people of such prominence were also very insecure. They were very self-critical. They were very anxious about their ability to continue to produce work as good as the illustrations that Norman had already completed or the books my father had written. This is a very little known torture associated with being considered to be great in your field. You are then held to a very high standard. You don't really know the source of your greatness. How could you know that? It's something that comes to you when you sit down to do the work. How do you know for sure it's going to come to you again? And again, I've heard so many quotes, in so many interviews where people of great achievement have said, yeah, but I always wonder whether I'm ever going to be able to do that again. And there's a famous story about Laurence Olivier when someone said to him after a dramatic performance of Hamlet or King Lear, and said, that was just the most fabulous performance. And he looked very downcast, and she said, what's wrong? And he said, I have no idea how I did it. I don't know that I can ever do it again. So there you are. That is, watch for that when you hear famous people being interviewed. It's really a very scary thing about being on such a high plane. There are charming stories about this. My brother Jan told me about visiting Norman's studio with my father, our father, And Norman was painting, I don't know what, but he had a big easel with a scene, some sort of scene on it. And he said to Jan, I'm going to put a bird in the scene. Where do you think I should put it? So Jan looked at this, thinking to himself, what? You're asking me where the bird should go? But it was a very, characteristic of Norman. He would ask for your opinion about something that was going to be on the cover of some magazine or in a beautiful frame somewhere. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, do you know that your father came up to me after the lecture and he asked me, was I okay? What did you think about this idea? Did I get that across? Was it clear? Constantly asking people for their reassurance. And of course, people interpreted that as he is so humble. It's just wonderful to see such a humble man who has so much success. It wasn't being humble. It was really needing reassurance. As he did all the time. Lovingly, I say that with love, but he sure needed a lot of reassurance, that man. I'm thinking there's another story that Kai told me that is on this theme. It's a little off-center, but Kai and Dad went to Norman's studio shortly after Norman had been in Washington having lunch with Ike. Ike had given a luncheon for some people. I've read in other sources that he just wanted to assemble some people he liked and have a nice luncheon, and so he invited Norman. And Norman, when Kai and Dad got to Norman's studio, they said, so how was your trip to Washington? How did you like Ike? And he said, well, I sort of held back. I was in this room full of people that I recognized, all the leaders of our country, and I just sort of stayed back against the wall because it was a little too much for me. But apparently Ike came over to Norman and said, Norman, what are you doing back here? Come on, come be with me. And Norman said, Ike, I'm a little uncomfortable at events like this. I'm kind of shy. And Ike said, I know, Norman, so am I. So that reflects a very nice way in which Ike shared with Norman a certain shyness. I believe that it was, he had some social shyness, but then remember that he went up through the ranks in the military and became a leader of soldiers and of all the armed forces, in fact, and led them through a war. And I don't know that either my father or Norman would have been very good at that. That's a different kind of chutzpah altogether. And much more, after all, both Dad and Norman, neither one of them had an academic degree. They didn't come up through any ranks. They just kind of burst on the scene. And Ike, on the other hand, was, step by step, which I greatly admire, but it's another kind of rising to prominence. It's a very different way of getting famous. I guess this theme of the insecurity, the charming insecurity that people experienced in both of these men has an important psychological kind of basis, which is if you experience a huge amount of success through your work, and you really have chosen work as the avenue through which you are trying to meet all of your needs, your emotional needs, and your need for connection with other human beings. This has been, for whatever reason from your early childhood, has seemed to you like the most promising route to getting the love and attention that you need. You've decided work is going to be the thing that you put your energy into because it's the most likely to succeed. But when that is your basis for connection with other people, and you get this reward, of course, from an audience, you get an enormous reward of applause, of expressions of love, you get letters, and so many people really feel that they do love you, care for you, that they believe they know you. People believe that they know the famous. If I have said something about Paul Newman to friends, I read something about Paul Newman, and anybody who has a big investment in the image of Paul Newman will say, well, you know, somebody else wasn't like that. They'll name another very famous actor and say, but he wasn't like that. So no matter what you say about the nature of being famous, people will tell you that the people they admire were not like that. They were different. And it's because we need to sustain those idealizations. We do, and it serves a purpose. I'm not suggesting that it's a bad thing. It definitely serves a purpose for all of us in our growth. But for the person who is famous, the reward that you get is not something you can internalize. When your mother looks at you lovingly, smiles down at you, offers you genuine, deep, motherly love, you internalize that. It becomes part of your sense of who you are. Very early in your life, it's vital. What you get from an audience, even if, I don't care how many people are in that audience, I don't care how excited they are, is not something you can internalize. It's not digestible food. It gives you a real high, makes you feel extremely gratified for a short period of time before you go home and you're alone again. And all I can say from everything I've observed, and I'm just suggesting you all observe this, in any interview with a famous person that you listen to henceforth, you will hear that that is not making them feel, okay, I am loved, I'm lovable, I'm okay, everything's okay. You are on a quest for further and further recognition, and that quest doesn't end. There does not come a time when you say, okay, I've had enough. I've been acclaimed, I have my Academy Award, I have my Nobel Prize. I can now rest, retire, listen to the birds. Doesn't happen. You always wonder, can I do it again? Okay, I'm talking a lot about the vulnerable side, and I'm going to end with two different things that are of such importance here. Along with this vulnerability, there's no doubt that these two people, and those in the category that I have placed them in of the geniuses, the famous, the ultimately famous, they must have a monumental drive and self-belief on a level that allows them to do the work they do. So along with the vulnerability that I've been describing is just a monumental belief in your own ability to do this work, and that what you produce is somehow a reflection of what is true and real for other human beings, and that it has importance. This is important, what I'm doing. And I am doing it well, and even if other people don't agree, as you know, my father stood up against Freud and Freudian followers, but he wrote what he wrote with a belief, this is true and this is real, and he had my mother to support that, but still it takes huge courage to put out ideas that fly, you know, that go against the grain, and you're going to hear about it, you know that. But in both of these men we're talking about, a huge confidence that underlay this self-doubt that I've been describing. And on a final note, there's something else they shared, and that should probably have come at the very beginning. They both had a wonderful sense of humor. And there's no doubt that that would have played a big part in their relationship with each other, and if you were around them together, they laughed a lot. They really shared a lovely sense of humor. We see that everywhere in Norman's work upstairs. I just wanted to share one thing which I will actually pass around because I just found this the other day, and it reflects, I believe, my father's wonderful sense of humor. This is a picture of me riding in a horse show when I was 10 years old. And it says, with our best wishes, Blaze Erikson. Blaze is the horse. The rider is me. And I think it is absolutely charming, and I'm just going to pass it around. They were a joy to be around, those two people, because they were so funny together. Those are my thoughts, and I would love to know whether you have reactions that you want to share, things you agreed with, didn't agree with, that you thought were totally wrong.